Snow falls endlessly over the Montana mountains, wrapping a lonely cabin in silence. Inside, an elderly woman named Helen Ward faces another winter of solitude. Until one stormy night, a faint whimper at her door changes everything. Two freezing German Shepherd puppies appear, their eyes filled with desperation and something far deeper purpose. As Helen takes them in, she has no idea that these fragile lives carry a secret that will awaken her own. A story of loyalty, love, and second chances where kindness becomes salvation. Watch till the end to feel the warmth that only true devotion can bring. Snow drifted across the open plains of Montana, falling in slow circles before settling on a cabin that leaned slightly against the wind. The mountains stood silent behind it, their peaks buried in clouds that never seemed to clear. Winter had been long, but for Helen Ward, every season felt the same. Quiet, cold, and endless. She was 68, though her reflection in the window told a different story. The lines on her face were gentle, not harsh. They belonged to a woman who had worked hard and spoken little. Her gray hair was pinned back neatly, her movement steady and careful, like someone who had learned to live without hurry. The cabin was small, built of pine that had aged to the color of ash. Inside, the scent of wood smoke and pine resin hung in the air. Helen kept everything in order. The kettle polished the chairs, aligned the curtains drawn to keep out the wind. The oil lamp on the table burned low, its flames swaying each time the walls trembled. She lit it every evening before the sun disappeared behind the ridge. It was more habit than hope. The flame gave off just enough light to chase the shadows from the corners. In the silence, she could hear the faint groan of the wooden beams, the creak of the roof as ice gathered along the edge. Somewhere outside, the wind carried the sound of a branch snapping. It always did. Dinner was a small pot of soup, the same kind she made each night: potatoes, carrots, a handful of lentils. She stirred it slowly, watching the steam rise. The warmth felt good against her face. Sometimes she imagined another bowl across from her, a hand reaching for bread, a voice asking how her day had been. The thought came and went like the wind, familiar but never lasting. When the soup was done, she poured it into a thick ceramic bowl and sat by the window. From there, she could see the valley below, white and untouched. The path that led to the nearest town had vanished weeks ago under the snow. No one came this far out anymore. The mail stopped arriving after the first storm, and the radio crackled with static more often than words. Yet Helen never complained. She had chosen this life of distance, though some nights it felt less like choice and more like surrender. The fire in the hearth flickered low. Helen rose, her joints stiff from the cold, and added another log. Sparks leaped up bright against the dark. The sound of crackling wood was the only company she had. She sat again, rubbing her hands together until the chill eased from her fingers. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees and the cabin groaned under its weight. Helen listened, counting the seconds between gusts. It was a small trick she used to remind herself that the storm, like everything else, would pass. She looked around the room. At the worn armchair by the fire, the row of books coated in dust, the framed photograph that stood on the mantel. It was turned face down. She had left it that way for years, though sometimes when the loneliness felt heavy, she would reach for it without thinking. Tonight, she did not. The lamp flickered again, and the shadows stretched long across the floor. Helen leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The rhythm of the storm outside was steady, almost soothing. Tomorrow would come the same as always. She would wake before dawn, light the stove, and begin another quiet day in the cabin on the edge of nowhere. Yet somewhere deep inside, a faint unease stirred. A whisper of change moving through the wind, too soft to name. The kettle hissed as it cooled and the lamp flame steadied. Helen drew her shawl tighter, unaware that the long winter ahead would not be like the others. Beyond the window, snow continued to fall, covering the path, the fence, and every trace of life around her. In the silence, the mountains waited, holding a secret that would soon reach her door. The morning came pale and heavy with frost. Helen woke before the sun as she always did. The air inside the cabin was sharp, biting at her lungs. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stirred the fire back to life. As the warmth crept through the room, she sat by the table waiting for the kettle to sing. Her eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel, the one she had turned face down the night before. For a long moment, she looked away. Then, as if pulled by something quiet but persistent, she rose and turned it over. The image stared back at her, a younger woman standing beside a tall man in uniform. His arm rested across her shoulders, and at his feet sat a proud German shepherd with steady eyes and ears tilted forward. Tom Ward had always stood like that, in calm, solid, unshaken, and beside him Max had mirrored his strength. Helen brushed a finger over the glass. The edges were cool, the surface dusty. 10 years had passed, yet the photograph still carried the faint scent of smoke, the one that never left after that day. Tom had worked with the police K-9 unit for most of his life. He used to say that loyalty was not something you trained into a dog. It was something you earned beside it. He and Max had been partners in every sense of the word. When they left for work, Helen could never tell who was leading whom. She remembered the mornings before sunrise when Tom would lace his boots by the door and call Max with a short whistle. The sound had been sharp, filled with purpose. Max would rush forward, tail high, ready to serve. Helen would stand by the window and watch them disappear down the gravel road, a man and his dog against the world. That was before the call came. She could still hear the voice on the phone, calm but strained. There had been an explosion at the training facility. A gas line, they said. Tom had gone back for another officer trapped inside. Max had followed him. Neither came out again. The days after blurred together. The house filled with flowers and condolences, with people speaking softly as though grief had ears. Helen had nodded, thanked them, and listened to none of it. When the uniforms left and the voices faded, the silence settled in. It never left. For months, she woke in the night, hearing phantom footsteps at the door, the low sound of a dog's breath near her bed. Sometimes she would whisper their names, hoping the echo might bring them back. But it never did. She sold their house in town and moved to the mountains, far from reminders and faces that pitied her. Out here, there was space enough for her sorrow. No one asked if she was all right. No one waited for her to smile. She found comfort in that emptiness. The years shaped her into someone else. The woman who once laughed easily now spoke little. The woman who believed in purpose now lived by routine. She did not pray anymore, though. Sometimes she caught herself whispering to the wind out of habit. As the morning light crept through the window, Helen turned the photo back down and stepped outside. The cold met her like an old companion. Snow covered the trees in perfect stillness, the world painted in white and silver. She looked toward the horizon where clouds were gathering dark and full. The air carried a low hum, the kind that warned of weather turning. She had seen storms before, but this felt different. The wind held a strange tone, almost alive, as if it carried a message she could not yet understand. Helen filled the woodpile beside the door, her breath rising in small clouds. The sky darkened, the first flakes beginning to fall again. She watched them spin and vanish against the ground. Somewhere deep inside, the unease from the night before returned stronger now. The kettle whistled inside the cabin, breaking her thoughts. Helen turned back toward the warmth, unaware that by the time the next storm passed, her quiet life would never be the same again. By midday, the sky had turned the color of slate. Clouds pressed low over the valley, heavy and unbroken, swallowing what little light remained. Helen stood at the window, a mug of tea cooling in her hands, and watched the first true gusts roll across the ridge. The trees bowed beneath them, their branches tossing like wild waves. The sound began softly, a long sigh moving through the pines. But within minutes, the wind grew sharp, roaring against the cabin walls. Snow whipped sideways, thick as smoke. Helen set her mug down and drew the curtains closed, though the fabric trembled as if alive. She moved through the small room, securing shutters, checking the latch on the door. Years of mountain winters had taught her what to expect: long nights, bitter cold, and the loneliness that came when the world outside disappeared behind walls of white. Still, something about this storm felt different. The wind did not come in waves. It pulsed uneven, as if carrying a heartbeat beneath its rage. The old radio on the counter crackled with static. Helen turned the dial, hoping for the weather station, but only fragments came through. A voice breaking, fading, then gone. She frowned and turned it off. Silence filled the room again, broken only by the rattle of loose shingles on the roof. By late afternoon, the snow had buried the fence post outside. The path that once led to the main road vanished under an ocean of white. The horizon was gone, replaced by swirling walls that seemed to close in on the cabin itself. Helen lit the oil lamp early, the yellow glow pushing back the dimness inch by inch. She checked her supplies. A few jars of canned beans, dried lentils, potatoes that had started to sprout. The wood pile would last a week, maybe more if she burned carefully. It was enough for most storms, but a flicker of worry passed through her chest. Winter had never felt so endless, so alive. As the evening deepened, the storm reached its full voice. The wind screamed down the chimney and the cabin shook under its assault. Snow forced its way through the cracks in the window frames, gathering in fine white dust on the sill. Helen tightened the latch again, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Beyond it, the world was invisible. She moved closer to the fire, feeding it another log. The flames flared, painting the room in shifting shades of orange and gold. The warmth touched her face, but the rest of the cabin seemed to retreat into shadow. The sound of the storm was constant now, a living thing pacing outside, scraping at the walls, testing the strength of her solitude. Helen pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat in her chair by the hearth. The kettle had long stopped singing, the water cooling on the stove. She closed her eyes and tried to listen past the wind, to the soft crackle of the fire, to the beating of her own heart. For a moment it worked. The chaos outside became distant, almost muted. But then came another sound. A low groan rolled through the timbers, followed by a sharp knock, as a loose branch struck the roof. She flinched, breath catching. The windows rattled again, louder this time, as though something beyond them pressed to come in. Helen rose, walking slowly to the door. She tested the handle. Solid. The hinges held firm. Still her fingers lingered there, tracing the cold metal as if expecting it to turn on its own. She stepped back, drew the curtain, and stood still. The air in the cabin felt thicker now, weighted with a kind of stillness that did not belong. Her reflection in the window looked older than before, eyes shadowed, searching for something beyond the glass. Outside, the snow fell harder, smothering every sound except the wind. It was the kind of storm that erased tracks, names, and memories alike. The world beyond her door no longer existed. Only this small circle of light flickering against the dark. Helen settled once more by the fire, her body wrapped in the rhythm of the storm. The lamp flame danced on the walls, stretching thin, then steady again. Somewhere deep inside, that unease returned stronger and closer. She drew the blanket higher around her shoulders, staring at the flames. The storm had reached its peak. Yet beneath its rage, she thought she heard something faint, a thread of sound, softer than the wind, too small to name. Helen leaned forward, listening. The storm ruled the night. Wind clawed at the windows and howled through the chimney, filling the cabin with a restless echo. Helen dozed in her chair, the blanket drawn tight, her head resting against the worn cushion. The fire had burned low, a bed of orange coals breathing in the darkness. Then came the sound again. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, a soft cry that rose and fell like a question. Helen stirred, half asleep, unsure if it came from outside or from a dream. She held her breath and listened. Only the storm answered. She closed her eyes, thinking it must have been the creak of a shutter, the moan of old wood. But just as her thoughts began to drift, the sound returned, a small whimper, trembling and real. Helen sat up. The hairs on her arms lifted. The sound came once more clearer this time, fragile and pleading, carried by the wind to her door. She looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass, thick and swirling. The world beyond was a blur of white. She hesitated, telling herself that nothing could survive out there tonight. Yet the cry came again, soft but desperate, and it reached something deep inside her, an ache she had tried to quiet for years. Helen rose slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The floor creaked under her feet as she crossed the room. She stood before the door, listening. The storm roared, but beneath its fury she could still hear it, a faint, broken sound full of fear. Her fingers found the latch. For a moment she paused, the cold seeping through the cracks around the frame. Opening the door in such weather was foolish. The snow could bury her in seconds. But that sound, it would not let her rest. She pulled the latch. The door opened a few inches, and a blast of wind swept through the room, snuffing the lamp's flame to a trembling glow. Snow spiraled inside, clinging to her hair and lashes. She squinted into the storm. The porch was barely visible beneath the whirling white. Then she saw them. Two small shapes huddled against the doorframe, pressed together for warmth. Their fur was stiff with ice, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Tiny paws shifted weakly in the snow. As Helen leaned closer, the light from the doorway brushed over them. Two German shepherd puppies, their eyes wide and glassy, glinting gold against the dark. Her heart clenched. She dropped to her knees, the cold biting through the thin fabric of her nightdress. One puppy lifted its head, letting out a faint whine before resting it against the other. The sound was barely a breath, but it carried more pain than words ever could. Helen reached out a shaking hand. The closer she came, the more she saw the frost clinging to their whiskers, the snow crusted along their legs. She touched the nearest one gently. Its fur was hard as ice, its skin beneath cold as stone. Yet at her touch a small tremor passed through its body, as if some part of it still believed warmth might exist. She whispered, voice trembling, "You poor things, what are you doing out here?" The other puppy tried to stand, but stumbled, legs folding beneath its tiny frame. Helen's chest tightened. She looked around. The storm offered no mercy, no trace of where they had come from. The footprints leading to her porch had already vanished under a blanket of snow. The wind slammed against the house again, shaking the door in her grasp. Helen gathered the two small bodies in her arms, feeling their weight, light, fragile, like bundles of breath. She rose, shielding them with the blanket, and turned back inside. The warmth hit her face as she pushed the door shut behind her. The puppies stirred weakly, pressing against her chest, their fur damp against her hands. The fire crackled low, waiting. Helen moved toward it, every step careful, her heart pounding. She could feel the faint rhythm of their breathing against her palms. The cabin, once silent and still, now held life again. Small, trembling, but alive. She knelt by the hearth, the glow of the fire painting her face in soft gold. The puppies whimpered once more, a sound both fragile and hopeful. Helen looked down at them, tears pricking her eyes. For the first time in years, the storm outside did not feel so empty. The firelight shimmered across the floor, its warmth spreading slowly through the cabin. Helen laid the blanket near the hearth and placed the two small bodies upon it. Their fur glistened with melted frost, thin steam rising from where the heat touched them. She reached out a trembling hand and brushed the ice from their faces. The softness beneath her fingers made her chest ache. One puppy gave a weak sigh, its breath shallow and uneven. The other stirred faintly, nudging closer to its sibling as if seeking shelter once more. Helen's throat tightened. They were barely more than skin and bone, their bellies hollow, their ears pressed flat from exhaustion. She fetched another quilt from the bed and wrapped it around them. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice quiet and tender. "You're safe here." The words felt strange on her tongue, gentle words spoken aloud to something living. It had been so long since she had said them to anyone. The fire popped, throwing sparks up the chimney. Helen leaned closer, her palms hovering over the small shapes to share her warmth. The smell of damp fur filled the room, mixed with the faint scent of smoke and pine. She listened closely, counting each breath they took. For a moment, she feared they would fade in her hands, disappear back into the cold that had nearly claimed them. One of them opened its eyes, a soft brown gaze clouded by fatigue, yet full of something that pulled at her heart. The puppy blinked slowly, its tiny chest rising and falling beneath the wool. The look in its eyes was not fear, but trust, fragile and unspoken. Helen smiled, a small trembling curve that surprised her. "You have a fighter spirit," she said softly. "Both of you do." She reached for the kettle, poured a little warm water into a bowl, and dipped a cloth into it. She rubbed their paws, gently melting the ice that clung to their pads. They whimpered, a sound that was both pain and relief. Helen kept talking, her voice steady and calm, as if her words alone could keep them anchored to life. "You remind me of someone," she murmured. Her eyes softened as memories stirred beneath the surface, but she pushed them aside. This moment belonged to the living. The fire grew stronger, filling the cabin with a golden glow. The puppies began to breathe more evenly. One lifted its head, for the first time its ears twitching toward the crackle of the flames. The other followed, pressing its small body closer to Helen's hand. Their tails moved faintly, the slightest flicker of life returning. Helen laughed under her breath, a quiet sound that startled even her. "Well," she said, "I suppose I cannot keep calling you little ones." She studied them for a moment, her gaze tracing their markings. The darker one, with a stripe along its back, the lighter one with bright amber eyes. "You," she said, pointing to the first, "will be Shadow. You look like a piece of the night trying to hide from the light." Then turning to the second, "And you will be Valor. There's courage in you still, even if the world tried to take it." The names felt right as soon as she spoke them. Shadow and Valor. Words once used by her husband when training his dogs, names that had filled her home long ago with pride and love. Saying them again felt like breathing warmth into old embers. The puppies, as if sensing something in her tone, gave small movements, Shadow resting its head on her knee, Valor curling beside it. Helen placed her hand over them both. The steady beat of their hearts pulsed against her palm, faint but growing stronger. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin a different kind of quiet took hold. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was peace, soft and alive. Helen sat there for a long time, watching the flames dance across their fur, her eyes reflecting the same glow. For the first time in years, the night did not feel long. It felt full. Morning arrived slow and pale. The storm had softened into a quiet fall of snow, the world outside calm again after its long fury. Inside the cabin, the fire still glowed, its warmth wrapping the room in a steady hush. Helen stirred from her chair, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Shadow and Valor lay curled together on the rug, their breathing even now, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm with the crackle of the fire. Helen smiled at the sight. For a moment she simply watched them, feeling a gentle stillness spread through her chest, a kind of peace she had not known in years. She poured water into a pot, the sound of it soft and familiar. As the kettle began to heat, she tore a piece of bread, soaking it in warm milk. The scent filled the cabin, faint and comforting. She placed the bowl near the fire. Shadow lifted his head, first ears twitching, nose quivering toward the smell. Valor followed, clumsy and eager, their small paws shuffled across the floor. They ate slowly at first, then with growing energy, tails giving faint, unsteady wags. Helen laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Easy there, you'll have plenty." Watching them stirred something in her memory. The way Shadow's ears tilted, the way Valor lifted his paw before leaning in. It all looked so familiar. She saw another German shepherd in her mind's eye, strong and proud, standing tall beside Tom on the training field. Max. The name rose within her like the scent of old wood smoke. Sharp, warm, impossible to forget. She closed her eyes, and the cabin faded into another place, a wide yard behind the police station grass, golden under the summer sun. Tom's voice rang clear and steady. Sit. Max obeyed before the word had finished leaving his lips. Stay. The dog's gaze never wavered, locked on his handler with perfect trust. Helen could almost hear the whistle Tom used, the single sharp note that called Max to heel. The sound of their footsteps in sync, the rhythm of command and understanding. Tom used to say it was more than obedience. It was faith. A dog like Max didn't just follow orders. He believed in them. She opened her eyes again. The fire flickered before her, its color shifting between gold and amber. Shadow and Valor had finished eating. They sat side by side, looking up at her as if waiting for her next word. Helen felt her throat tighten. The look in their eyes, the calm, unwavering focus, was the same as Max's. That deep, wordless connection between trust and devotion. It reached across years, across loss, as if the spirit of what she once knew had returned through these two small lives. She knelt beside them and stroked their fur. It was warmer now, soft beneath her fingers. You remind me of him, she said quietly, of the one who never left Tom's side. Shadow tilted his head, listening. Valor pressed his nose into her palm. The simple gesture undid her. She leaned forward, she resting her forehead against their fur. The scent of life filled her senses. Earth smoke and something pure that she could not name. Memories moved through her like ripples, Tom's laughter, the weight of Max's head on her lap, the way both had filled her home with purpose. For years she had shut those memories away, fearing they would break her again. But now, sitting beside the fire with Shadow and Valor, she realized they no longer hurt. They warmed. The fire popped a spark, leaping toward the stone hearth. Helen lifted her head and watched the small flame flicker out. The two puppies had settled again, one resting on her knee, the other at her feet. The morning light grew brighter, streaming through the frost-lined window. Helen glanced at it, feeling something shift inside her, a quiet sense of gratitude, of belonging, as if the years between what was lost and what had returned had folded into a single heartbeat. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow. Inside, Helen reached for the old radio on the shelf, turning the knob to find the morning broadcast. The speaker hissed a faint whistle, breaking through the static. At that sound, both Shadow and Valor lifted their heads sharply, ears pricked, bodies alert. Helen froze. Their sudden focus sent a tremor through the room. The whistle repeated, once thin and distant. Shadow barked sharp and clear. Valor followed his voice, strong for the first time. Helen stared at them, the sound echoing off the cabin walls. Her pulse quickened. Something about that reaction, the discipline, the precision, felt impossible. She whispered to herself, "Where did you come from?" The puppies turned toward the door, eyes fixed on something beyond the snow, their bodies tense, ready. Helen rose slowly, her breath caught between fear and wonder. The quiet she had built for years was changing piece by piece, as if the past itself had found her again. The radio crackled again, the thin whistle fading into a faint hum. Helen turned the knob back and forth until the static cleared enough for a voice to come through, a calm, steady tone reading the morning news from town. She barely heard the words. Her eyes stayed on the two puppies by the fire. Shadow sat upright, ears still pointed toward the radio. Valor stood beside him, tail lowered, posture focused. They didn't look frightened. They looked trained. Helen tilted her head. "Sit," she said without thinking. Both dogs obeyed instantly. She blinked. For a moment she thought it might have been luck, coincidence. She tried again, her voice soft but firm. "Stay." Neither of them moved. The breath caught in her chest. She stepped closer, crouching near the firelight that flickered against their eyes. They held her gaze calm and certain, as if waiting for what came next. Helen laughed under her breath, a sound mixed with awe and disbelief. You really are something else. She reached out and stroked their heads, feeling the smooth, warm fur beneath her fingers. When she whispered, "Good boy," both tails gave a small, synchronized wag. The motion sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the snow deepened again, pressing against the windows like a soft white wall. The world beyond the cabin seemed far away, but the small space inside now felt alive. Shadow and Valor followed her every movement as she went about her chores. When she rose to fetch wood, they trotted behind her. When she sat again, they settled close, their bodies forming a quiet circle around her chair. The day passed in that rhythm, fire, crackling, snow falling, soft breath filling the silence. Yet something about them kept drawing her attention. Their alertness never faded. Every sound, every shift in the wind made their ears twitch. That evening, as Helen prepared a small bowl of food for them, the radio let out another sound, a sharp burst of static followed by a single tone. It was the same note she had heard that morning, a whistle like the one Tom had once used in training. Both dogs jumped to their feet. Shadow barked once, short and precise. Valor stood still beside him, waiting. Helen froze in place, the spoon trembling in her hand. "That's no accident," she whispered. She turned down the radio and looked at them, her heart beating fast. Her husband's voice echoed in memory. A well-trained canine never forgets a command once it's learned. Could these two truly be trained? And if so, how had they ended up at her door in the middle of a storm? She moved closer and knelt, searching their collars for tags, but there were none. Only the faint mark of worn leather where one might have been. "Someone must be missing you," she murmured. "Someone important." Shadow leaned forward and licked her hand. Valor followed, pressing close as if to reassure her. Helen smiled weakly. "Or maybe you were meant to find me." The fire flared brighter for a moment, as though answering her. Its light danced across the walls, painting the cabin in gold and red. Helen sat back, watching the flames sway. For the first time in a decade, the stillness around her didn't feel like absence. It felt like a pause before something new began. Outside, night crept in again. The wind rose, brushing against the door in low, steady moans. Helen stoked the fire once more and checked the latch. The puppies had curled beside her chair, their breathing steady, their warmth close enough to feel against her legs. She turned off the lamp, letting the glow of the fire fill the room. The crackling wood sounded almost like a whisper, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse of her heart. Just as she began to drift towards sleep, a sound cut through the quiet. A single bark, sharp, clear, and certain. Helen's eyes opened. Both puppies were standing now, facing the door, their bodies stiff and ears raised. The fire flickered, throwing long shadows across the room. The wind outside had changed. It carried something beneath it, a tone deeper than before, distant yet real. Helen sat up slowly, her breath shallow. "What is it?" she asked in a whisper. Neither dog moved. Their gaze stayed fixed on the dark beyond the window. The night had found its voice again, and it was calling to them. The sound of the bark still echoed through the cabin when silence returned, thick and watchful. The fire had burned low, its glow now soft and uneven. Helen could hear her own heartbeat, quick and uncertain beneath the whisper of wind against the door. Shadow stood closest to the threshold, his body tense, tail stiff, ears pointed toward the noise outside. Valor was beside him, head-low, teeth bared just enough to glint in the firelight. The quiet strength she had seen in them earlier was still there, but now it was edged with instinct, with purpose. Helen whispered, "It's all right, there's nothing out there." Her voice was calm, but her hands shook. Neither dog turned to her. Their focus stayed on the door, every muscle alert. Shadow gave a short growl. Low, steady, meant as a warning. Valor followed, a softer sound, more uncertain but just as ready. The wind rattled the window panes, but beneath it came another noise, faint and distant. A metallic clang as if something loose had struck the fence outside. Helen froze. The sound came again, followed by what might have been footsteps, slow, uneven, muffled by the snow. Her stomach tightened. Probably just a branch, she said aloud, though the words felt thin, unconvincing. Shadow moved forward, nose pressed to the bottom of the door, breathing fast. Valor's ears flicked at every sound, his body trembling with energy. Then, as if agreeing on an unspoken cue, both began to bark, short, precise bursts that filled the room. Helen winced, pressing her hands to her ears for a moment before lowering them again. "Hush now," she said softly, stepping closer. "There's no one here." But she could feel it too. The shift in the air, the cold that had crept through the wood like a breath from something alive. The fire flared as the wind pushed down the chimney, sending a shower of sparks across the hearth. The noise outside stopped. The world went still. Shadow's growl deepened a sound that came from his chest. Valor stepped closer to the window, peering through the frost-lined glass. His tail flicked once, then stilled. Helen followed his gaze, squinting through the dim reflection. The snow outside moved strangely, not drifting like before, but shifting in heavy patterns as though something large passed through it. She couldn't see what it was. The lantern by the window cast only a faint glow, swallowed quickly by the darkness beyond. Helen's throat tightened. She reached for the poker by the fire, gripping it tightly. "All right," she whispered to herself. "If someone's out there, we'll handle it." The cabin creaked, its old timbers groaning under the pressure of the wind. Somewhere near the back wall came another sound, a scrape, then a soft thud, as if something brushed against the side of the house. Both dogs turned toward it immediately. Shadow barked again, sharp and fast. Valor pressed against his side, growling in rhythm. Their eyes glimmered with focus, not fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ready. Helen felt the air shift around them, charged with a kind of energy that pulled her out of her own fear. She crouched beside them, whispering, "You're good boys." Her voice steadied as she spoke. "Whatever it is, we'll stay together." The words seemed to calm them. Their barking eased into low rumbles, still wary, but less frantic. Helen kept her eyes on the door, the poker still in hand. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. Time stretched by the slow rise and fall of the wind. Then came a faint noise again, almost delicate. A metallic clink, followed by silence. Helen held her breath. The sound repeated once further away this time, then vanished into the storm. Shadow's ears twitched, and he let out a short bark, but Valor only stood still. His head tilted as if listening to something deeper than sound. The fire crackled the shadows along the walls, shifting in uneasy rhythm. Helen finally exhaled. "Whatever it was, it's gone," she murmured, though her voice carried no certainty. She stirred the fire again, feeding it a new log. The dogs did not relax. They stayed close to the door, their eyes never leaving it, their bodies alert. Helen sank into her chair, the poker still resting across her knees. The storm outside had quieted, yet her mind could not settle. Somewhere beyond that wall of white, something had moved, something that did not belong. The fire gave a final pop, sending sparks up the chimney. Shadow's head lifted at the sound, a soft growl rising from his throat once more. Valor joined him, both facing the door again. Helen's heart thudded in her chest. She turned toward the sound they heard, but could not see a flicker of unease settling deep in her gut. The night held its breath. The night deepened, though the storm had passed. Outside, the air carried a quiet so heavy it felt alive. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still whispered along the edges of the roof, sliding through cracks in the wood. The cabin, warm and dim, seemed to float in an ocean of white. Helen sat upright in her chair, the poker still across her knees. Shadow and Valor stood before the door, their bodies, rigid eyes fixed on something she could not see. The faint sound that had stirred them earlier had gone silent again, yet neither dog moved an inch. "Easy," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "It's just the wind." But as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. A soft crunch came from outside, snow compressed under weight. Then another. Slow, uneven steps, too measured to be the wind, too heavy to belong to any wild animal she knew. Her pulse quickened. Helen rose from her chair, every movement cautious. She went to the window and drew the curtain back just enough to peer through. The glass was rimmed with frost, the world beyond blurred and silver in the moonlight. For a long moment, she saw nothing but trees, dark spines rising from the white ground. Then one of the shadows moved. Her breath caught. A figure, tall, indistinct, slipped between the pines. It moved deliberately as though searching. The snow swallowed its steps, but she could feel the rhythm of its movement. Not random, not lost, purposeful. Shadow growled low and steady. Valor stepped forward to the window, the fur along his back bristling. Helen's hand went instinctively to the latch, pushing it down until she heard it click. She turned away from the window, heart hammering in her chest. "Stay close," she said, though her voice trembled. The dog stood between her and the door, their eyes locked on the dark beyond the glass. Another sound came. The faint metallic scrape she had heard before, followed by a muffled thud. Something brushed against the outer wall of the cabin near the back corner. Shadow barked once sharp and loud. The sound split the silence like lightning. Helen jumped, then pressed a hand to her chest. "Quiet," she whispered, though she didn't mean it. Part of her was grateful for the noise. It made the fear feel real, not imagined. She crept to the back window. The snow reflected enough light to make shapes visible, the outline of the woodpile, the old fence, the bare branches swaying. For a moment there was nothing. Then movement again. A flicker, a shape that passed quickly through the trees. She blinked hard. "Who's there?" she called out, before she could stop herself. The only reply was the echo of her own voice carried off by the wind. Valor barked again, louder this time. Shadow pressed close to the door, his paws scraping against the floorboards. Their growls vibrated through the small room. Helen's hands began to tremble. She reached out to steady herself on the table, her fingertips brushing the cold metal of the lantern. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Its light cast long, uneven shadows across the floor, making the walls seem to breathe. Helen turned in a slow circle, scanning every corner as if expecting something to step through the dark. The sound outside faded, replaced once more by that dreadful stillness. Even the wind seemed to stop. The only movement came from the two dogs pacing back and forth before the door, their eyes glinting amber in the half-light. Helen swallowed hard. "All right," she murmured, trying to sound calm. "Whatever it is, it's gone." But her gaze drifted back to the window, to the snow pressed against the glass. There, just for an instant, she saw it again. A faint imprint, the shape of a hand, brushed into the frost before vanishing. She stumbled backward, the breath leaving her body. Shadow growled, a deep, resonant sound that filled the room. Valor moved closer to the window, his ears twitching, his nose pressed to the cold pane. Helen's voice cracked as she whispered, "Dear God." The shadows outside remained still, but she no longer trusted the quiet. The sense of danger had changed. It wasn't passing. It was waiting. Helen stepped back from the window and checked the latch again. She turned the lock once more, though she knew it was already fastened. Shadow stayed in front of the door, Valor beside him, both tense as coiled springs. Helen sat down again, her hands gripping the poker, her eyes fixed on the flame that flickered weakly in the hearth. The night stretched long around them, the silence broken only by the dog's steady breathing and the whisper of the wind returning through the trees. Helen didn't move, didn't speak. She knew she wouldn't sleep. Neither would they. The night dragged forward in silence that seemed to hum, Helen stayed near the fire, the poker still resting across her knees. Every now and then the logs cracked, breaking the stillness before fading again into quiet. The flames had sunk low, throwing soft shadows across the walls. Shadow and Valor hadn't moved from their posts. Their eyes stayed fixed on the door, their breathing slow and steady. Every few minutes one would give a low growl that barely rose above the whisper of the fire. Helen had stopped trying to calm them. There was something in their tension that kept her alert, something she didn't yet understand but could feel deep in her bones. She rubbed her hands together, trying to shake off the chill that had settled inside her. The unease from earlier had grown heavier, settling like frost in her chest. She glanced toward the shelf above the fireplace, toward the small wooden box that had stayed closed for 10 years. Her fingers hesitated before she stood and reached for it. Dust coated the lid, soft as ash. When she opened it, the faint smell of oil and metal rose to meet her. Inside lay a revolver, Tom's old service weapon. The metal caught the light of the fire as she lifted it with trembling hands. She sat back down, resting the gun on her lap. The cold weight of it brought back a rush of memories. She hadn't touched it since the day they buried him. Tom had taught her how to load and clean it years before, insisting that living in the mountains required self-reliance. Her hands moved almost on their own. She broke open the cylinder, checked the chambers, and found them still loaded. The bullets were old but dry, shining faintly under the glow of the fire. Her breath came uneven, a rhythm between fear and familiarity. Shadow let out another growl, lower this time, his ears twitching. Valor joined him, standing firm beside the door. Helen raised her gaze to them. "All right," she murmured, "I hear you." She rested the revolver beside her, the barrel pointed toward the floor. The sound outside had faded again, yet the air in the room still felt charged, as if holding its breath. Her eyes drifted to the mantel. The photo of Tom sat in its frame, half illuminated by the fire. His uniform, his steady smile. It all came back with painful clarity. She could almost hear his voice again, calm and certain as he spoke to her during their years together. If Max ever barks without cause, he'd said, "Once you listen, a good dog sees what we can't. Trust him." Helen swallowed hard. The words echoed through her like a pulse. She looked toward Shadow and Valor. Their bodies were steady, their focus unbroken. They weren't frightened, they were protecting her. For years, Helen had filled her nights with silence, mistaking it for safety. Now she saw how fragile that silence truly was, and how easily it could shatter. The fear that had crept into her heart since the storm no longer felt like weakness. It felt like awareness. She reached out a hand toward the dogs. "You're good boys," she whispered. "You know more than I do." Valor turned his head at her voice, his eyes reflecting the light of the fire. Shadow stayed fixed on the doortail, stiff ready. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time since Tom's death, she felt the small spark of something she thought she had lost trust. She picked up the revolver again, holding it steady in both hands. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her grip didn't waver. She took a slow breath, her gaze shifting between the door and the window. Outside, the wind had stopped. The world was utterly still. The silence was too perfect, the kind that hides movement beneath it. Shadow growled once more, his body tense. Valor's ears twitched, and his head lifted slightly. Helen's heart hammered as she followed their gaze toward the window. A faint sound drifted through the stillness, a crunch of snow closer this time, then a low metallic click, like a latch being tested. Helen raised the revolver and pointed it toward the door. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "Tom," she whispered, "if you're still watching, keep us safe." The fire flared suddenly, a spark leaping from the wood. The dogs barked in unison, sharp and sure, their voices echoing through the cabin. Helen froze, eyes wide. The warning had come. Dawn came pale and heavy, washing the snow in dull shades of gray. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind was deeper, more unsettling. Helen stood by the window, the revolver still resting on the table beside her. Her eyes felt dry, her body stiff from a night without sleep. Shadow and Valor lay near the door, awake, but still, their ears twitching at every distant sound. They hadn't barked again, though their watchful eyes never strayed far from the window. Helen exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the cold glass as she looked out. The world seemed unchanged, just snow, endless and white. But then her gaze caught something new. At the far edge of the yard near the line of pines, a shape broke the smooth surface of the snow. She squinted, pressing closer to the window. The object was dark, half buried under drifted snow. It wasn't there the day before. Her stomach tightened. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside. The cold bit into her face, sharp and immediate. Shadow followed her to the door, but stopped at her command. "Stay," she said gently, voice steady, though her hands trembled. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way across the yard. The morning air was still, no sound but her footsteps. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she saw what it was. A snowmobile tipped on its side. Its front panel cracked and one runner bent inward. The engine cover was half torn off. Helen's breath caught. Tracks led away from it. Boot prints pressed deep into the snow. She knelt, touching one of the prints. The size startled her. Whoever made them was large, taller, and heavier than anyone from town she could recall. The steps led toward the woods, not back to the road. A cold realization crept through her chest. Someone had been out here during the storm. Someone close. She stood and looked around. The trees stood in silence, dark shapes against the white. Her pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to go back inside. She did. The dogs were waiting by the door, tails stiff, eyes alert. When she entered, Shadow sniffed at her boots, then turned toward the window again. Helen locked the door behind her and crossed to the table. The revolver was still there, right where she had left it. She picked up the old radio from the shelf and turned the dial. Static hissed through the room, broken occasionally by fragments of speech. She leaned closer, adjusting the antenna, trying to catch the signal. "Search, Northern Ridge, possible sighting." The voice faded into static again. Helen tapped the side of the radio. "Come on," she muttered. The noise returned sharper this time. "Escaped last night. Armed and dangerous." Her fingers tightened on the dial. Then the transmission cut out, completely replaced by the low hiss of interference. Helen lowered the radio slowly, the words echoing in her mind. Escaped. Armed. Dangerous. She turned toward the window once more. The snowmobile was still there, black and broken in the white expanse. The boot prints were already filling with fresh snow. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through her. Shadow moved closer to her side. Valor followed, his head tilted as if reading her fear. Helen crouched down, resting a hand on each of their backs. Their warmth steadied her, but her heart still pounded in her chest. "Looks like you were right," she whispered. "There was something out there." The dogs pressed closer to her, their bodies firm, their eyes locked on the door. Helen rose and pulled the curtains shut. She moved to the stove, lighting it to make tea. Anything to keep her hands busy, to fill the silence. The kettle began to warm, and the sound of steam was a small comfort. Yet her thoughts kept circling back to the snowmobile, to the footprints, to the faint radio message that had vanished too soon. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint creak from the woods, a sound like branches moving, or maybe something heavier. Helen turned sharply, staring at the door. Shadow and Valor's heads lifted at the same moment, their bodies tense. The sound came again, closer this time. Helen reached for the revolver, her hand shaking but steady enough to hold the weight. She stepped back toward the fire, her eyes never leaving the window. Then the radio came to life again, with a burst of static followed by a single sharp tone. Both dogs barked once in perfect unison. Helen froze. From somewhere beyond the trees, a faint echo answered, a hollow metallic noise like the slam of a distant door. She knew then that she was not alone. By late morning, the world outside had turned calm again. Snow rested untouched across the valley, smooth and glittering beneath a weak sun. Inside the cabin, the scent of simmering soup filled the air. Helen moved slowly, stirring the pot, trying to quiet the unease that had taken root in her chest. Shadow and Valor lay near the hearth, but neither was fully at rest. Their ears twitched with every sound, their eyes shifting toward the window now and then. The revolver sat on the table beside Helen, polished and ready. She forced herself to focus on the rhythm of the spoon scraping against the pot. The movement kept her hands steady, her mind from drifting back to the broken snowmobile or the echoing noise from the woods. "You're imagining things," she whispered. "It's over." Then came the crash. A loud, jarring thud struck the side of the cabin, followed by the sound of boots crunching through the snow. The spoon slipped from her hand, clattering against the pot. Both dogs leapt to their feet, barking in unison, their bodies tense. Helen froze, her breath sharp in her throat. Another sound followed, the slam of a car door, then another. A deep voice shouted something she couldn't make out through the thick wooden walls. She turned toward the window, her heart pounding. Through the frost, she saw a flash of color, some blue, then red, slicing through the pale morning light. The snow outside reflected it, painting the whole cabin in a stuttering glow. "Police," she breathed. Thank God. For a moment, relief swept through her. She moved quickly to the door, unlatched it, and pulled it open. The cold rushed in, sharp and biting. Outside, half a dozen figures moved through the snow, their uniforms dark against the white. Police vehicles lined the edge of her yard, engines, humming lights, spinning in steady rhythm. 2 officers stood near the porch, their hands raised slightly. "Ma'am," one called, his voice firm but not unkind. "Please step back inside." Helen blinked, confused. "There's been someone in the woods," she said, her words tumbling out fast. "A snowmobile crashed. Someone could be hurt." The lead officer glanced toward the trees, then back to her. His expression was tight focused. "We know, ma'am. Please step back for your safety." Shadow barked again, sharp and protective. Valor stood beside him, his fur bristling. Helen turned to hush them, but the officer's next words froze her in place. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we're looking for a fugitive. He escaped custody during last night's storm. We have reason to believe he may have passed through this area." Helen's mouth went dry. "A fugitive?" "Yes, ma'am." The officer's gaze flicked past her shoulder into the cabin. "We need to check the property. Please step aside." Her mind reeled. The snowmobile, the footprints, the metallic sounds in the night, all of it crashed together in a single realization. Someone had been near her house. Maybe still was. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the door. "There's nothing here," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. "Just me and—" Before she could finish, one of the younger officers stepped forward, his eyes widening as he looked past her into the cabin. "Sir," he called over his shoulder, "you need to see this." The lead officer climbed the steps, stopping just inside the doorway. His gaze went straight to the 2 dogs standing near the hearth, their bodies' rigid eyes locked on the strangers. For a moment, everything went still. The officer's face changed. Recognition, then disbelief. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "where did you get those dogs?" Helen blinked, startled by the question. "They came to my door last night. They were freezing. I took them in." The man nodded once, his voice low but urgent. "Those aren't just dogs." Behind him, the others moved closer, the lights from their vehicles flashing through the window. Red and blue washed over the cabin walls, the rhythm of it like a heartbeat. Helen looked down at Shadow and Valor. Their ears were up, eyes alert, but they made no sound now, only waited still as stone. The officer turned to her again. "Ma'am, please stay calm," he said. "These dogs belong to our K9 unit. They went missing during the storm, while tracking the fugitive we're hunting." The world tilted around her. What she whispered. "You mean these two?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer said. "They're trained police dogs, and if they found their way here, it means the man we're looking for was closer than we thought." Helen stood frozen in the doorway, the wind tugging at her coat, the lights pulsing around her. Behind her, the fire cracked softly. The dogs stayed silent, their bodies poised as though they understood every word. And for the first time since the storm began, Helen realized the danger had not passed. It had only just begun. The lead officer stepped fully into the cabin, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The other officers fanned out behind him, their radios crackling faintly with static. Helen stood motionless, her hand gripping the door frame for balance as the warmth of the fire brushed her back. Shadow and Valor didn't move. Their eyes followed the newcomers, alert but calm, their stance firm. One of the younger officers knelt down, studying their collars with careful hands. His voice broke the tense silence. "Sir," he said softly, "these are from the Central Canine Division. Identifiers match Shadow and Valor, both missing since the storm." The lead officer nodded once. They were part of the tracking team on the ridge. He turned to Helen. "Ma'am, these dogs were on duty when the fugitive escaped. The storm separated them from their handlers. We've been searching for them for 2 days." Helen felt her knees weaken. 2 days, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. But they were out there in the snow, freezing, half dead. How could they? "They're trained for survival," the officer said, his tone steady but respectful. "Still, it's a miracle they made it this far." The weather was brutal. The others didn't think they'd last the night. The words hung heavy in the small cabin. Helen looked down at the 2 dogs beside her. Their fur was still damp from the melted snow, their eyes bright and focused. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The younger officer stood glancing at his superior. "They followed the route almost exactly," he said, checking his notes. "The path leads from the ridge through the frozen valley. That's nearly 20 kilometers. Helen's breath caught. "They ran through the storm." "Yes, ma'am," the officer said. "And judging by their direction, they came straight here." The cabin seemed to shrink around her. She sank into her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why here?" The lead officer hesitated. His eyes moved to the dogs, then back to her. Canines are trained to seek shelter when they lose contact with their team, but they're also trained to follow threat scent trails. If they came here, it's because they sense danger close by. They were warning you. Helen looked at Shadow and Valor, her throat tight. The thought of them running through the storm, battered by wind and snow, driven by duty, left her wordless. She whispered, "They saved me." The officer's expression softened. "Seems that way, ma'am." He looked around the room, then gave a quick nod to the others. "Check the perimeter. Make sure he's not still nearby." The sound of boots filled the air again as the officers moved outside. Through the window, Helen could see them spreading out across the yard, their figures dark against the white snow. The flashing lights painted the trees in red and blue shadows, moving between them like ghosts. Helen turned back to the dogs. They sat quietly now. Tails still, ears lifted toward the sounds beyond the cabin walls. She knelt beside them, placing a hand on each head. The warmth of their bodies radiated through her palms, steady and strong. "Shadow. Valor," she said softly. "You found me." Their eyes met hers, steady, unblinking, full of something that felt almost human. Gratitude. Recognition. She closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she saw Tom again, standing on the training field years ago, calling for Max. His voice carried the same tone she heard in her own, now love wrapped in command, respect bound to faith. Her heart ached, but not from grief, from awe. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled from outside, cutting through her thoughts. "Tracks confirmed behind the ridge," a voice said, "heading toward the forest line. Looks recent." The lead officer turned sharply toward the door. "Copy that. Form a line. We'll sweep the woods." Helen rose as he spoke, her hands clenched together. "You're going after him." He nodded. "We have to. The tracks lead straight behind your property. Stay inside, ma'am. Lock the door and keep those dogs close." She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. Shadow had already risen, standing tall by the door, Valor beside him, both staring into the distance where the woods began. The officer looked at them and gave a short, approving nod. "They'll know if he's near. Trust them." The words echoed through her chest like a memory. Trust them. Helen stepped back as the officer left, closing the door behind him. The sound of shouting and snow crunching filled the air outside, fading gradually as the search moved deeper into the trees. Inside the cabin was quiet again, the fire burning low. Helen stood beside the dogs, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the window. She whispered to herself, "You two weren't lost. You were sent." Shadow turned his head toward her voice, eyes glinting in the firelight. Valor let out a low whine, resting his head on her knee. Helen stroked his fur, her gaze drifting to the flickering glow on the walls. Somewhere out there, danger still moved among the trees, but here for a moment she felt safe, guarded by two lives that had found her through the storm. Then from beyond the woods, a distant shout broke through the calm, followed by a sound sharper than wind. Gunfire. The sharp cracks of gunfire split the silence, echoing across the frozen valley. Helen flinched, her hand flying to her chest. The sound rolled through the trees like thunder, then faded into shouting voices carried by the wind. Shadow sprang to his feet, ears pricked, body tense. Valor followed, letting out a sharp bark that broke the still air inside the cabin. Both dogs turned toward the door, their instincts awakened. "Stay," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "Please stay." But they didn't move. The energy in the room shifted, something powerful and urgent like the pulse of a storm returning. The firelight flickered against their coats, catching the fierce shine in their eyes. They were no longer the fragile creatures she had pulled from the snow. They were soldiers again, ready to serve. Another gunshot rang out closer this time. Helen stepped toward the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Through the curtain of snow still drifting from the trees, she saw flashes of light, police torches sweeping through the woods, their beams cutting through the gray dawn. Shadows moved quickly between them. Dark figures shouting orders. "Dear Lord," she whispered. Her hands clasped together as she closed her eyes. "Keep them safe. All of them." Outside, the chaos grew louder. Radios crackled with static and urgent voices. Then came another burst of sound, a single shout, sharp and commanding, followed by a bark that was too clear to be mistaken for any other. Shadow's ears twitched. Valor lifted his head and answered with a low growl, stepping forward. Helen reached down to stop him, but he pushed gently past her leg, his gaze locked on the door. Shadow followed their bodies, moving in perfect rhythm, their tails low controlled. The sound of their breathing filled the small room. Helen's throat tightened as she whispered, "You can't go out there." Yet she knew, even as she said it, that they wanted to. Every muscle in their bodies spoke of purpose, the kind that no command could undo. Another flash lit up the woods outside, blue and red colliding in the snow. The wind carried the sound of men shouting again, closer now, desperate and strained. Shadow barked short and sharp. Valor pressed against the door, whining softly, his tail flicking once. The cabin felt too small to contain them. Helen dropped to her knees beside them, her hands gripping their collars. "You've done enough," she pleaded. "You've already saved me. You don't need to go back out there." But their eyes told her what she already knew. Duty lived in them. It was not something they could abandon, not while danger called. For a moment the fire roared, casting bright light over the room. Helen saw her reflection in their eyes. An old woman clutching two heroes, and in that instant she understood the truth Tom had once told her. Loyalty is not a thing taught, but something born unshakable and pure. She let go. Shadow turned toward the door, his body straight head high. Valor followed his movement smooth despite the tremor in his limbs. Helen stood and opened the door a crack. The cold slammed into her fierce and sharp, but she didn't flinch. "Go," she whispered. "Do what you were meant to do." Both dogs bounded into the snow, vanishing almost instantly into the storm's pale light. Their paw prints stretched toward the trees, the sound of their barks merging with the distant echoes of the officers. Helen stood in the doorway, the wind tearing at her hair, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. She whispered a prayer into the frozen air, her voice trembling. "Bring them back safe, all of them." The flashes of blue and red pulsed brighter now, flickering between the trees like beacons. Then another shot cracked through the air, followed by silence. Helen pressed her hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. The world held still for one long, breathless moment. Then, somewhere in the distance, she heard barking again, strong, commanding, alive. Her knees weakened, and she sank against the doorframe, closing her eyes. The sound carried hope. The forest had gone quiet. The gunfire had stopped. Only the wind moved now, carrying faint echoes through the trees. Helen remained at the doorway, staring into the distance where the officers and her two brave companions had vanished. The air felt too still, too fragile to breathe. Minutes passed, then an hour, maybe more. The fire behind her burned low, its light spilling across the floor like a path back to warmth, but she couldn't leave the door. Every nerve in her body listened for sound, any sound that would tell her the fight was over, that they were safe. Then faintly through the blanket of snow and silence came voices. She stepped outside, squinting against the cold. Figures moved through the whiteness, dark shapes growing clearer as they approached. The red and blue lights pulsed behind them, dim through the snow. She counted 3 officers, one leaning on another's arm. Behind them, walking steady despite exhaustion, were Shadow and Valor. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. "Thank God," she whispered. The lead officer reached the porch first. His face was pale with cold, but his eyes were alive with relief. "It's done," he said, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "We got him." Helen stepped aside to let them in. The cabin filled again with noise. The shuffle of boots, the rustle of gear, the deep panting of the dogs. Shadow and Valor stood just inside the door, shaking snow from their coats' tails low but wagging weakly. Their fur was marked with patches of ice, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The officer removed his gloves and crouched beside them, patting their heads with a kind of reverence. "Good work, boys," he murmured. "You led us right to him." Helen stared, her voice caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. They found him." The officer nodded. "Tracked him to a ravine behind your property. The fugitive was armed, but the dogs alerted us before he could reach the road. We might not have made it in time without them." He stood again, looking at Helen with quiet sincerity. "Without these pups' signals, you wouldn't have made it through the night." He was closer than anyone realized. The words sank into her slowly, like warmth spreading through frozen ground. Helen turned to the dogs. Shadow had lowered himself to the floor beside the hearth, eyes half closed, while Valor sat at her feet, watching her face. She knelt beside them, tears gathering in her eyes. "So it was you," she whispered. "You kept me safe." Valor pressed his nose into her palm. Shadow gave a soft, tired whine, his head resting on her knee. The simple contact undid her. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling into their fur as she stroked them gently. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, reporting back through their radios, but Helen barely heard them. The world around her had narrowed to this small circle of light, the 2 lives that had entered her home as strangers and revealed themselves as protectors. She thought of Tom, of the way he used to kneel beside Max after each mission hand on the dog's back, whispering words of thanks that no one else could hear. Now she found herself doing the same, her voice trembling through the quiet. "You did it," she said. "You saved me just like he once did." The cabin felt different now. No longer just a shelter from the storm, but a place of grace, of survival. The lead officer stepped forward again, his tone gentler. "Ma'am, they'll need rest and medical care. We'll take them back to the station once the snow clears." Helen nodded slowly, her eyes still on the dogs. "Of course," she murmured. "They've earned that." The officer paused, then added softly, "You have too." She smiled faintly, though her tears didn't stop. "No," she said, brushing a hand over Shadow's ear. "I just opened a door." Outside, the storm clouds finally broke apart, revealing a pale streak of dawn. Light spilled through the window, touching the walls, the fire, and the quiet faces of the dogs. Helen sat there for a long time, the revolver still on the table, cold but harmless now. Around her, everything was still. The officers speaking in low tones, the fire crackling softly, the dogs breathing slow and even. For the first time since the night began, she felt peace. It wasn't loud or grand, it was the kind that comes only after fear has passed, the kind that lingers in the silence after survival. Helen reached out her fingers, brushing both dogs at once. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. Valor lifted his head, eyes warm and steady. Outside, the snow glowed gold in the morning light. By afternoon, the sun had climbed higher, melting a thin layer of frost from the cabin roof. The storm had left behind a fragile calm, the kind that feels like the breath after a long cry. Helen sat near the fire, her coat folded across her knees, watching as the officers gathered their gear. The two dogs rested close by, their fur clean now, their eyes half closed in contentment. They had eaten drunk, warm broth and fallen into the kind of sleep that only follows exhaustion and victory. Helen had watched them for hours, unable to look away. But now, it was time. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice soft. "Ma'am, we'll be taking Shadow and Valor back to the station. The vet's waiting for them and the rest of the unit wants to see them home." Helen nodded, though her throat ached. "They've earned it." He gave a small, understanding smile. "So have you." She looked down at the dogs. "They saved my life," she said quietly. "I'm not sure how to thank them." "You already did," the officer replied. "You kept them alive long enough to finish what they started." The words should have been comforting, but they carried a gentle weight. Helen knelt beside the dogs, running her hands through their fur. "You hear that, boys?" she whispered. "You did it." Shadow stirred first, stretching before pressing his head into her palm. Valor followed, sitting up slowly, his tail brushing the floor in slow, steady movements. Their eyes met hers, warm, questioning, as if they sensed the change in the air. The officer clipped the leads to their collars, and Helen's breath caught. Shadow turned toward the door without protest, but Valor hesitated, pressing his body against her knee. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice breaking. She cupped his face in both hands, feeling the steady heat of him, the heartbeat beneath the fur. "Go on now. You belong with them." Valor whined softly, licking the tears from her cheek. Shadow stepped closer too, nosing her wrist as if in agreement. The officer waited patiently by the open door, snowlight spilling across the floor. Helen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to steady her breath. "All right," she whispered. "Be brave." The dogs hesitated at the threshold, their paws sinking slightly into the fresh snow. The wind stirred, carrying the faint hum of distant engines. The other officers stood by the vehicles, their voices low, respectful. Valor looked back once more. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice as she said softly, "You found your way through a storm to me. I'll never forget that." Shadow barked once, a short, clear sound that echoed in the quiet yard. It wasn't loud. It was a promise. Helen smiled through her tears. "Go on, then." The two German shepherds stepped into the light. The snow crunched beneath their paws, their dark shapes framed against the white world beyond. The officer followed, leading them toward the waiting cars. Helen moved to the doorway, leaning against the frame. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't step back inside. She wanted to see them until the last possible moment. As the doors of the police vehicle opened, Valor turned again, pulling slightly on the lead. The officer paused, letting him. The young dog's gaze found her one last time, steady and bright. Shadow stood beside him, silent and proud. Helen raised a hand, her smile trembling. "Goodbye, my brave boys." The officer gave a gentle command and both dogs climbed into the vehicle. The engine started, the tires crunching softly as the convoy began to move down the snow-covered road. The red and blue lights blinked once more across the pale hills before fading into the trees. Helen stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, her hand pressed over her heart. The wind had picked up again, carrying the faintest echo of a bark across the valley, a sound both joyful and sorrowful, fading slowly into the distance. She closed the door gently, leaning her forehead against the wood. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a memory. They were gone, but the silence they left behind was no longer heavy. It was tender. Helen sank into her chair by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart hurt, but it beat strong and sure, filled with something new, a quiet pride, an echo of purpose. Outside, the last traces of the storm drifted away into the blue sky. The days that followed unfolded in soft, quiet rhythm. The snow began to melt, forming small rivers that trickled down the hill behind the cabin. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind skies so blue that they almost hurt to look at. Inside, the house felt different. It still held its familiar creaks and sighs, the faint smell of pine smoke and wool, but it no longer carried the weight of emptiness. The silence that used to echo through the rooms had changed its tone. It now felt like peace, not loneliness. Helen moved slowly through the cabin that morning, her steps unhurried. She tidied the table, folded the blanket by the fire, and swept away the traces of the long night that had changed everything. Every object she touched carried a memory. The pot still faintly smelling of broth, the towel she'd used to dry two trembling bodies, the wooden floor where paw prints had melted into small pools of water. She stopped at the mantel, her gaze lingering on the photo of Tom and Max. Dust had settled lightly along the frame. She brushed it away with her sleeve, tracing her finger along the outline of their faces. The calm strength in Tom's smile, the steady alertness in Max's eyes. Next to the photo, she placed a new one. It was a picture taken by the officers before they left, a moment captured outside her cabin at sunrise. Shadow and Valor sat side by side in the snow, their coats bright against the pale morning, their eyes reflecting the light. Behind them stood the faint outline of Helen, her hand resting on their backs. She looked at the two frames now standing together, the past and the present meeting in quiet harmony, her heart filled with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Tom," she whispered, smiling faintly, "you'd have liked them." The fire crackled softly behind her. She turned, pouring herself a cup of tea, and sat down by the window. The valley stretched far below, endless and white at its edges. Somewhere out there, life was moving again. And for the first time in a long time, she felt part of it. Helen reached for the old notebook that sat on the shelf above the stove. It was bound in worn leather, the pages yellowed with time. She hadn't written in it since Tom's death. The thought of words had once seemed pointless, like talking to an empty room. But now she felt the need to write, not to fill the silence, but to honor what had broken it. She opened to a blank page, picked up her pen, and began to write. "The night the storm came, I thought it would take everything from me. But instead it brought them. Two souls who carried courage in their hearts and loyalty in their bones. I gave them shelter, but they gave me something greater. They gave me a reason to open my door again." Her handwriting was slow, careful. Each line carried memory, each word a heartbeat. She wrote about the storm, the fear, the sound of the first whimper outside her door. She described their eyes, the way they trembled, the way they stood guard when she was too afraid to move. She wrote about trust, about how it had found its way back to her through two lives that could not speak yet said everything she needed to hear. By the time she finished, the sun had climbed high, painting the snow in shades of gold. Helen closed the notebook, her hands steady. The heaviness that had shadowed her for 10 years felt lighter, as though part of it had been carried away on the morning air. She stood and walked to the door, opening it wide. The breeze swept through the cabin, cool and clean. She breathed deeply, letting it fill her lungs. For years she had feared the quiet after Tom was gone, the long stretches of time where the only sound was her own heartbeat. But now, standing in that same quiet, she realized it was no longer something to fear. It was simply life, steady and kind. Helen smiled and turned back toward the mantel. The two photos caught the light. 4 faces connected by time, by duty, by love. Not alone anymore, she murmured. The wind answered softly through the trees, carrying the faint echo of a bark, far away, fading into the open sky. A month passed and winter began to loosen its hold. The valley no longer slept beneath heavy snow. Thin patches of earth showed through, and the pines glittered with melting frost. Helen had settled back into her quiet rhythm, tending the fire, mending small things, taking long walks along the edge of the woods. The nights no longer felt empty. Sometimes she thought she could still hear faint paw steps in the snow outside, or the soft whine that used to come from the hearth. The memory of Shadow and Valor lived in the walls, in the warmth, in the silence that now comforted her instead of haunting her. One morning, while clearing the table after breakfast, she heard the sound of tires crunching against the thawing road. She looked through the window. A mail truck stopped by the old wooden post at the end of her path, its engine humming softly. The driver placed something in her box and gave a polite wave before driving away. Helen wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the chill air. The sun was bright, the sky a pale silver blue. She reached the mailbox and pulled out a single envelope. The paper was thick, the seal stamped with the emblem of the local police department. Her heart gave a small, sharp flutter. She turned the envelope over in her hands, then carried it carefully inside. At the table, she took a slow breath and opened it. Inside was a letter typed neatly on official paper. The first line made her eyes sting before she had even finished reading it. Dear Mrs. Ward, we wanted to reach out to you personally to share some good news. The 2 German shepherds you sheltered during the storm, Shadow and Valor, have completed their final certification exams. Both have been officially inducted into our K9 division. Helen's hand trembled as she continued. Their recovery and retraining went faster than anyone expected. Their loyalty and intelligence are remarkable, and the entire unit credits their survival to your care. They have been given their official names in honor of what they endured. Valor for courage, and Shadow for devotion. We call them the Storm Brothers. She smiled through the tears that blurred her vision. Their first mission was completed last week. They located a missing child in the northern woods and led rescuers safely to him in record time. The officers on duty said they worked as one, alert and unyielding. We thought you'd like to know that their service has already changed lives. The letter continued with details about the dog's progress, their handlers, and how the department had chosen to recognize them publicly at a small ceremony. In the hall where we honor the canines who have served this town, we've added a plaque with their names and yours. It reads, For loyalty shared, for courage renewed. Dedicated to Helen Ward, whose kindness in the storm gave heroes a home. Helen set the letter down, pressing her hand to her mouth. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, but she was smiling. The world seemed to still around her, as if even the fire was listening. She reread the final paragraph. We hope you'll visit sometime soon. The handler said Shadow and Valor still pause at the door of their kennel each morning, looking out as if waiting for someone they miss. You're part of their story, and always will be. Helen leaned back in her chair, the letter resting in her lap. She looked toward the photographs on the mantel, Tom and Max, and beside them Shadow and Valor. The four faces reflected the same spirit, a single thread of courage connecting them all. "Tom," she said softly, "they made it." The fire crackled in reply. Outside, the sky had turned golden with the afternoon sun. She rose and walked to the door, opening it wide to let the light spill inside. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and distant smoke. Somewhere far beyond the hills, she imagined two figures running, strong, graceful, free. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "My brave boys." For a moment she thought she heard a bark echo faintly against the wind, low and bright, the kind that sounded like joy. Helen stood there a long time, the letter pressed against her heart. Pride swelled inside her, quiet and deep, not loud like grief, but steady like peace. The snow was almost gone, the earth ready for spring. She smiled, a warmth filling her chest as she whispered, "You kept your promise." Morning sunlight poured through the window, soft and gold, brushing the edge of Helen's kitchen table. A month had passed since the letter arrived, and life in the cabin had returned to its steady rhythm. She had grown used to quiet mornings again. Tea steaming in her hands, the gentle tick of the clock, the sound of birds returning to the thawed valley. Yet sometimes when the wind moved just right, she could still hear echoes of paws in the snow, the faint rhythm of two hearts beating beside her fire. Those memories had become her company, warm, alive, and steady. That morning she stood by the window watering a small pot of seedlings when a low hum drifted up from the road below. Tires on gravel. A car engine slow and deliberate. She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. Few people ever came this far into the hills. The sound grew closer. She stepped to the door, heart quickening. A familiar shape appeared at the bend in the road. A police vehicle, silver and blue sunlight glinting off its roof. It rolled to a stop just beyond her porch, the engine quieting into a low purr. Helen blinked, hardly daring to breathe. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out in uniform. The same officer who had led the search that night. He smiled up at her, eyes kind. "Good morning, Mrs. Ward," he called. "Hope you don't mind a surprise visit." Helen's lips parted, but before she could answer, another sound reached her ears. Sharp and bright, a bark that cut through the air like music. Her hand flew to her chest. The back doors of the vehicle opened. Two figures leapt out, strong, sleek, alive. Shadow landed first, snow scattering beneath his paws. Valor followed his tail, sweeping the air like a banner of joy. Both dogs paused for only a heartbeat before bounding toward her. Shadow, Valor. Their names left her lips like prayer. She stepped off the porch, and in a moment they were upon her. Two bodies of fur and energy pressing against her legs, circling her, whining with excitement. Shadow's head pushed into her hand. Valor's paws brushed her knee as he barked his tail, wagging so hard it bent his body sideways. Helen laughed through her tears, kneeling to meet them. "Oh, my brave boys. Look at you." She buried her face in their fur, breathing in the familiar scent of warmth and life. They licked her cheeks, her hands, her sleeves, their joy so pure it filled the space around them. The officer stood back smiling as he watched. "They remembered you," he said softly. "The moment we turned onto your road, they started barking. I think they knew exactly where we were." Helen nodded, still smiling through her tears. "They always knew the way." The officer handed her a small envelope. "The department wanted me to deliver this. It's an official commendation for your part in their rescue. And for them, it's a rest day. Thought they'd like to spend it somewhere they remember." Helen took the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said. Shadow sat beside her now, calm but alert, his amber eyes watching her every movement. Valor lay at her feet, rolling slightly onto his side, content as a child beside its mother. Helen stroked their heads, her voice tender. "You've grown stronger. You're heroes now." The officer chuckled. "They're still the same at heart, loyal as ever." The three of them stayed like that for a long while. Helen sitting on the steps, the dogs pressed close, the spring wind brushing through their fur. She looked up at the sky. The last of the snow lingered in shaded patches glittering in the sun. Tom would have been proud, she murmured. He always said loyalty never fades. It just finds new hands to hold. Shadow tilted his head as if listening. Valor barked once as though answering her. When it was time for them to leave, the officer gave a gentle whistle. The dogs hesitated. Shadow turned to her, his tail still wagging. Valor pressed his nose into her palm once more, his breath warm against her skin. Helen smiled through the ache rising in her chest. "Go on, boys," she whispered. "The world needs you." They stepped back toward the car but looked over their shoulders again and again until the officer opened the door. Helen stood on the porch as the car rolled down the road, the sound of barking fading into the wind. She lifted her hand, waving until the trees hid them from view. The morning quiet returned soft and golden. She could still feel the warmth of their fur on her hands, the rhythm of their hearts against hers. For a long time she stood there smiling, the ache in her chest gentle now, more like love than loss. That evening the world fell quiet again. The sun slipped behind the mountains and soft dusk settled over the valley. Helen sat by the hearth, the steady crackle of fire keeping her company. The warmth brushed her face, and the shadows on the walls danced like old friends. A light snow had started outside, gentle, almost shy. The flakes caught in the glow of the window and drifted downward, slow and graceful. It was the first snow in weeks, a soft echo of the storm that had once changed everything. Helen leaned back in her chair, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The letter from the K-9 division rested on the table beside her along with her open notebook. The pages were filled now, lines of neat handwriting written in calm reflection rather than grief. She set the cup down and began to read aloud, her voice low but steady, filling the small room with the sound of memory. "I thought I saved them," she said softly, eyes glimmering with the firelight. "But the truth is, they found me first." The words lingered in the air. She closed the notebook gently, her fingers resting on its worn cover. When Tom was gone, she continued quietly, "I built these walls to keep the world out. I thought silence was safety, but it was only waiting. And somehow through the storm, two hearts found their way to my door and reminded me that love doesn't disappear. It just changes shape." The fire popped, sending a trail of sparks up the chimney. Helen smiled faintly, her eyes turning toward the window. Outside, the snow thickened, soft flakes swirling through the pale night. The wind was no longer sharp. It hummed gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. She stood and walked to the mantel. The photos were still there, Tom and Max on one side, Shadow and Valor on the other, 4 loyal souls bound across time. The light from the fire flickered across their faces, making their eyes seem alive. Helen traced her fingertips across the frames. "You kept your promise, Tom," she whispered. "You said loyalty never fades." She moved back to her chair, her joints slow but steady, and settled again before the hearth. For a moment she let the stillness fill the room. The flames reflected in her eyes, and in the faint rhythm of their movement, she could almost see them again. The shapes of Shadow and Valor curled on the rug, heads resting against her knee, their eyes bright and trusting. The memory was so vivid it felt real. She could almost hear their breathing, steady and warm. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, brushing against the window pane with soft taps. Helen smiled, her gaze distant but peaceful. "I hope you're running free tonight," she said softly, "somewhere wide and wild. And when you stop, I hope you remember this place." The fire crackled louder, and the cabin filled with its golden glow. It shimmered against the glass, and for one fleeting moment, Helen thought she saw 2 pairs of eyes reflected in the window, bright amber, full of life. She didn't move or blink. She only smiled, her heart steady and full. "Kindness and loyalty never die." She whispered the words barely above the hush of the fire. "They just find new hearts to live in." The clock ticked softly on the wall. The firelight swayed. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the valley in white. And in that small cabin on the edge of the mountains, the warmth of loyalty and love burned bright, eternal, as the storm that had once brought it home. The story of Helen, Shadow and Valor is not only one of survival, it is a reflection of the quiet, unbreakable bond between humans and animals. In their courage, we are reminded that compassion often begins in the smallest gestures: a door opened in a storm, a hand extended toward another life in need. German shepherds, loyal and steadfast, have long been symbols of devotion and courage. They protect, serve, and love without hesitation. Yet beyond their strength lies something deeper, a heart that mirrors our own capacity for faith and connection. When Helen welcomed Shadow and Valor into her home, she didn't just rescue them from the cold. She reignited her own ability to trust, to hope, and to love again. This story carries a simple truth. Kindness has a ripple effect. What begins as an act of mercy can return to us in unexpected ways, often greater than we could imagine. Through the bond between one woman and two loyal dogs, we see that love is not bound by species or circumstance. It endures through loyalty, gratitude, and the shared will to protect life. In a world that often moves too fast, let this be a reminder to pause, to care, and to open our hearts. Every act of kindness toward animals, toward people, toward the fragile and the lost, creates light in places that might otherwise remain dark. Helen's story ends where hope begins, in the warmth of the fire, the loyalty of two faithful hearts, and the truth that compassion once given never truly fades. It simply finds new lives to touch.